The cursed village of New Mexico. The wind whispered secrets through the brittle bones of the dying town. Once a thriving mining village in the heart of New Mexico, the settlement of Sable Ridge had been swallowed by time and tragedy. Its decaying buildings, hollowed out and weather-beaten, stood like tombstones of a forgotten past. No one ventured into Sable Ridge willingly anymore. The place had earned a reputation over the decades, a reputation that kept even the most adventurous souls at bay. But not everyone heeded the warnings. The sky was painted with strokes of fiery orange as Annalise Crowley gripped the steering wheel of her battered SUV. Her knuckles turning white, the road to Sable Ridge was narrow and cracked, overrun with weeds that seemed eager to claim the last remnants of civilization. Annalise had heard the stories, ghostly apparitions, inexplicable disappearances, and a curse so old that no one remembered its origin. But stories were just that, stories. She wasn't one to believe in folklore or ghostly tales. Annalise was a journalist, a seeker of truth, when she stumbled across a reference to Sable Ridge in an old, dusty newspaper archive. She couldn't resist the pull. A town abandoned overnight, with no clear explanation? It was a mystery begging to be unraveled. "I'll be out in a couple of days," she had assured her editor back in Albuquerque. "Just need to get some photos, dig into the local records, and maybe interview a few locals." What she didn't say was how much she needed this story. Her career had been stagnating for months, and her personal life wasn't faring any better. A good piece on the eerie history of Sable Ridge could be her ticket back to relevance. The air grew colder as Annalise neared the town limits, the sun dipping below the horizon and plunging the landscape into shadows. She passed the faded sign that read, "Welcome to Sable Ridge, Est, 1872. Its letters barely legible beneath layers of rust and grime. Her headlights caught glimpses of old storefronts, their windows shattered and their signs swinging on rusty hinges. The streets were eerily silent. No animals scurried across the road. No birds called from the trees. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Annalise parked in front of what had once been the town's general store. The building leaned precariously to one side. Its roof caved in, but it still stood, a testament to stubbornness. If nothing else, she grabbed her camera and stepped out of the car, her boots crunching on the gravel. The air smelled of dust and decay. "All right," she muttered to herself, adjusting the camera strap on her shoulder. "Let's see what you've got." Sable Ridge. She snapped a few shots of the general store, then moved on to the town square. The centerpiece was an old fountain, long dry and choked with weeds. A rusted plaque at its base bore the inscription, "To those who built our future." A chill ran down her spine. Though the evening wasn't particularly cold, Annalise wandered the streets, documenting the crumbling buildings and the oppressive emptiness. The deeper she ventured into the heart of Sable Ridge, the stronger the sensation grew, that feeling of being watched. She shook it off, chalking it up to her overactive imagination. Towns like this had a way of playing tricks on the mind. Then she heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It was almost too soft to catch, like the rustling of leaves. But there were no trees nearby. She froze, holding her breath. "Hello?" The whisper stopped. The silence pressed in around her, heavy and suffocating. Annalise's pulse quickened. She spun around, her eyes scanning the shadows. Nothing. "Get a grip," she told herself. "It's just the wind." But it didn't feel like the wind. Determined to shake off her nerves, Annalise made her way to the old town hall. If there were any records left, they'd be there. The building loomed before her, its windows like dark eyes watching her approach. The front doors were locked, but a side window hung open, its glass long gone. Annalise climbed through, landing with a soft thud on the dusty floor inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and old paper. Shelves lined the walls, their contents scattered and decayed. She pulled out her flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. Files, ledgers, newspaper clippings. Most were too damaged to be useful, but she sifted through them anyway, hoping for a clue. Then she found it, a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. The handwriting inside was elegant but hurried. The ink faded but still legible. The first entry was dated September 3rd, 1910. The shadows are growing stronger. I fear what we have done. Annalise's breath caught in her throat. She flipped through the pages, her heart racing. The entries grew more frantic, detailing strange occurrences, voices in the night, missing villagers, and a darkness that seemed to seep into the very bones of the town. The final entry read, "It is too late. We have sealed our fate. May God have mercy on our souls." A loud crash echoed from somewhere deep within the building, snapping Annalise out of her trance. Her flashlight flickered. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. Clutching the journal to her chest, she backed toward the window. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but curiosity held her in place for a moment longer. A shadow moved at the edge of the flashlight's beam. Annalise didn't wait to see what it was. She scrambled through the window and sprinted back to her car, her heart pounding in her chest. As she fumbled with the keys, she glanced back at the town hall. The windows were dark once more. The shadow, whatever it had been, gone. But the feeling of being watched remained. Annalise sat in her car, trying to catch her breath. The journal lay on the passenger seat, its presence both comforting and unnerving. She knew she should leave, but something about the journal called to her. There were answers hidden in its pages, answers she couldn't ignore. "I'll just stay one more night," she told herself, just long enough to read more of the journal. The sun had long since set, and the town was bathed in darkness. Annalise drove to the edge of town, where an old motel stood in surprisingly good condition. The sign above the door flickered weakly, "Sable Ridge Inn, vacancy." She checked in, the clerk barely acknowledging her presence. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale. He handed her a key without a word. Her room was small but clean, with faded floral wallpaper and a creaky bed. Annalise locked the door and drew the curtains before settling onto the bed with the journal. The entries grew darker with each page, detailing rituals performed in secret, desperate attempts to ward off an encroaching evil. "We have awakened something ancient." One entry read, "Something that cannot be contained." A knock at the door made her jump. "Who is it?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Her pulse quickened. She crept toward the door, pressing her ear against it. Another knock, louder this time. Annalise backed away, her heart in her throat. The journal slipped from her hands, landing on the floor with a thud. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then, a voice, soft and chilling, whispered through the door. "You shouldn't have come here." The air inside the motel room was thick with tension. Annalise stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, as the voice on the other side of the door whispered again. "You shouldn't have come here." Her mind raced. Was it just a prank? A local trying to scare off a nosy journalist? Or was it something far more sinister? Something tied to the unsettling entries in the journal she had just begun to decipher. Gathering her courage, she took a step toward the door and pressed her eye to the peephole. Darkness stared back at her. Whoever, or whatever, had been there was now gone. But the unease lingered. Annalise exhaled slowly, her hand trembling as she double-checked the lock. She retrieved the journal from the floor and placed it on the small desk by the window. Her instincts told her to pack up and leave immediately, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. "I need to know what happened here," she whispered to herself. She flipped open the journal once more, determined to uncover the secrets that had been hidden in Sable Ridge for over a century. The next entry in the journal was dated October 15th, 1910. The handwriting was more frantic, the ink smeared in places as though written in haste. "The shadows have claimed another. Thomas is gone. We warned him not to wander after dark. But he didn't listen. They always take the curious ones first. Annalise frowned. Shadows? Could it be a metaphor? Or had the author truly believed something was lurking in the darkness? She leaned closer, her eyes scanning the rest of the page. We must complete the ritual before the full moon, or the entire town will be consumed. There is no other way. May God forgive us. The words sent a chill down her spine. Ritual? Full moon? Annalise glanced at her phone's calendar. The next full moon was just 2 nights away. The sound of footsteps outside her window snapped her back to the present. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. Shadows flickered just beyond the thin curtains. Moving slowly, deliberately, grabbing her flashlight, she edged toward the window and pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. The street outside was empty, bathed in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. Annalise released a shaky breath, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I'm just scaring myself, she muttered, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just her imagination. The next morning, Annalise decided to seek answers from the only person she knew would still be in town, the motel clerk. His hollow eyes and distant demeanor had unsettled her the night before. But now, she was determined to get some answers. The small lobby smelled of stale coffee and mildew. The clerk sat behind the desk, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the walls of the motel. Excuse me, Annalise said, trying to sound casual. I was wondering if you could tell me a little more about the town's history. The clerk didn't respond immediately. His eyes slowly shifted to meet hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of fear in them. You shouldn't be here, he said quietly. No one stays in Sable Ridge. Not for long. I'm a journalist, Annalise explained, holding up her press badge. I'm researching the town's past. I found an old journal. The clerk's eyes widened at the mention of the journal. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. You found the journal? Then it's already too late. Too late for what? Annalise pressed. What happened here? The clerk glanced around, as if checking for unseen watchers. Before answering, the curse. It began with the mine. They dug too deep, disturbed something they shouldn't have. After that, the shadows came. Annalise's pulse quickened. What do you mean? The shadows? They're not just shadows, the clerk said, his voice trembling. They're alive. They watch. They wait. And when the time is right, they take what they want. The room seemed to grow colder. Annalise swallowed hard, her journalistic instincts at war with the primal fear rising within her. Why didn't anyone leave? She asked. Some tried, the clerk said, his eyes darkening. But the shadows don't let you leave once you've seen them. Not really. Annalise shivered. And what about you? Why are you still here? The clerk smiled, a sad, haunted smile. Someone has to warn the others. That afternoon, Annalise decided to visit the old mine. If the curse truly began there, it was the logical place to continue her investigation. The mine sat on the outskirts of town, its entrance yawning like a hungry mouth in the side of the hill. Weeds and twisted vines clung to the rusted metal gate that blocked the entrance. A faded sign read, "No entry, danger." Ignoring the warning, Annalise slipped through a gap in the gate. Her footsteps echoed in the cavernous space as she made her way deeper into the mine. The air was thick with dust and the scent of earth and rust. Her flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing jagged rock and ancient mining equipment left to rot. Shadows seemed to shift at the edges of the light, but she told herself it was just her imagination. Then she heard it, a low, guttural whisper. It echoed through the tunnels, growing louder, closer. Annalise's heart pounded in her chest. She spun around, her flashlight flickering. "Who's there?" she called, her voice echoing off the walls. The whispering stopped. Silence. Annalise took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run. But as she turned, her flashlight caught something carved into the wall, a symbol. ancient and ominous, glowing faintly in the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached out to touch the symbol, her fingers brushing against the cold stone. The ground beneath her feet trembled. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Shadows poured from the walls, swirling around her like a living storm. Annalise ran, her flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit always just out of reach. Finally, she burst out into the daylight. Gasping for air, she collapsed onto the ground, her heart racing. The shadows retreated back into the mine, their whispers fading into silence. Annalise lay there for a moment, staring up at the sky. She knew she couldn't leave, not yet, not without uncovering the full truth. But one thing was certain. The curse of Sable Ridge was far more real, and far more dangerous, than she had ever imagined. The cursed house in the Louisiana. The swamp was alive with whispers, hidden beneath a thick veil of Spanish moss and shrouded in dense fog. Willow Marsh lay in the forgotten heart of Louisiana's bayou country. Locals rarely spoke of the swamp's secrets. When they did, it was in hushed tones, over flickering candles and strong drinks, recounting tales of the Blackthorn House, a place said to be cursed by dark magic and haunted by restless spirits. But not everyone believed the stories. The evening sky burned crimson as Mara Boudreau navigated her old pickup truck down a narrow, rutted dirt road. Her fingers tapped nervously on the steering wheel, the rhythmic hum of the tires doing little to calm her nerves. The air was thick and humid, clinging to her skin like a damp blanket. Almost there, she whispered, glancing at the hastily scribbled directions on the back of an envelope. Mara had spent her childhood in Louisiana, but she had never ventured this deep into the swamp. The Blackthorn House was a mystery she had heard about in stories from her grandmother, a house once owned by a powerful voodoo priestess named Evangeline Blackthorn, who vanished without a trace over a century ago. It was a house Mara had been warned to stay far away from. But life had a funny way of bringing her back to the things she thought she had left behind. A strange letter had arrived at her office a week earlier, addressed to her in looping, elegant handwriting. It contained nothing but an invitation. Come home. The answers you seek are waiting at Blackthorn House. Mara didn't know what answers the letter spoke of, but she felt an irresistible pull to follow the call. The dirt road ended abruptly at the edge of a stagnant pond. Beyond it, barely visible through the fog, stood the Blackthorn House, a hulking, decaying structure wrapped in shadows. Its sagging roof and shuttered windows gave it the appearance of a slumbering beast. Waiting to awaken, Mara crossed a rickety wooden bridge, her boots echoing against the worn planks. The air smelled of wet earth and rotting vegetation. Frogs croaked in the distance, and the water rippled with unseen movements beneath the surface. Standing before the house, Mara hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but curiosity pushed her forward. She stepped onto the porch, her eyes tracing the intricate patterns carved into the wooden columns, symbols she recognized from her grandmother's old books on Louisiana folklore. The front door creaked open on its own. Mara Boudreau, a voice whispered from within. It wasn't a question. Mara froze, her pulse quickened, her heart thudding against her ribs. Summoning her courage, she stepped inside. The interior of the house was a maze of shadows and decay. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, revealing dark stains beneath. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and something far less pleasant, something old and rotten. A grand staircase twisted upward into darkness, its banister carved with the same strange symbols she had seen outside. The front door slammed shut behind her. Mara spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Hello? Silence. She pulled out her flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. Dust motes swirled in the air, and the floorboards groaned beneath her weight. Her footsteps echoed through the empty halls as she made her way deeper into the house. A portrait hung at the end of the hallway. It depicted a regal woman with piercing eyes and a knowing smile, Evangeline Blackthorne. Mara had seen the face before in old family photographs. Her flashlight flickered. The eyes in the portrait seemed to follow her. Shaking off the unease, Mara pressed on. She found herself drawn to a large room at the back of the house, a parlor filled with faded velvet chairs and an ornate fireplace. A wooden table stood in the center, covered in yellowed papers and strange trinkets. Candles, long melted into puddles of wax, surrounded a large, open book. Mara reached for the book, her fingers brushing against its brittle pages. The writing was in French, but she recognized enough to piece together its meaning. The ritual must never be completed. To do so would awaken the darkness beneath. A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the weak light of her flashlight. The house groaned around her, the walls seeming to close in. Then she heard it, a soft, melodic humming. It was coming from upstairs. Mara's skin prickled. Every instinct told her to leave, but the humming called to her, irresistible and haunting. Taking a deep breath, she ascended the staircase, each step creaking beneath her weight. The humming grew louder as she climbed, echoing down the hallway like a ghostly lullaby. At the top of the stairs, the door to one of the bedrooms stood ajar. Pale light spilled from within, casting long shadows across the floor. Mara stepped inside. The room was eerily pristine, untouched by the decay that plagued the rest of the house. A rocking chair sat in the corner, its gentle creak in perfect rhythm with the humming. The source of the sound, a woman with her back turned to Mara. Rocking slowly. "Hello?" Mara whispered, her voice trembling. The woman stopped humming. The chair creaked to a halt. Slowly, the woman turned. Her face was not human. Mara screamed, stumbling back into the hallway. The humming resumed, louder and more menacing, chasing her down the stairs and through the labyrinthine halls. She reached the front door and threw it open, sprinting across the porch and back onto the rickety bridge. The house loomed behind her, its windows glowing with an unnatural light. As she reached her truck, the humming stopped. For a moment, the swamp was deathly silent. Then the voice from earlier returned, soft and chilling. "Welcome home, Mara." Mara sat in her truck, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, staring at the hulking silhouette of the Blackthorne house through the fog. The voice still echoed in her mind, "Welcome home, Mara." She wanted to leave, to turn the key and speed away from this cursed place. But something inside her wouldn't let her go. Answers. She had come for answers, and she wasn't leaving without them. The house stood silently in the mist, waiting. Taking a deep breath, Mara opened the truck door and stepped out. The fog wrapped around her like a shroud, muffling the sounds of the swamp. She felt eyes on her, though she could see no one. Each step toward the house felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself were thickening around her. The front door was still ajar, just as she had left it. It creaked on its hinges as she pushed it open, revealing the dark interior. The air inside was colder than before, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decayed wood. Her flashlight flickered weakly as she swept its beam across the foyer. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "You've got this." Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she made her way back toward the parlor. The book was still on the table, its brittle pages rustling in a faint, non-existent breeze. Mara reached for it, but before her fingers touched the paper, a sudden noise from upstairs made her freeze. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving toward the top of the staircase. Mara's pulse quickened. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet refused to move. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then the humming began again. It was the same haunting melody she had heard before, soft and melodic, yet filled with an unmistakable menace. This time, however, it was closer, much closer. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Mara turned and climbed the staircase once more. The humming grew louder with each step, guiding her down a long hallway. Her flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in near darkness. She stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway. It was different from the others, newer, with a polished brass handle that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Mara hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The humming ceased. The silence was deafening. Slowly, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was filled with mirrors, tall, ornate mirrors that lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Each one reflected a slightly different version of the room, distorting reality in subtle, unsettling ways. Mara stepped inside, her reflection multiplying around her. In the center of the room stood a large, antique mirror with a gilded frame. Its surface shimmered like liquid silver, rippling as though it were alive. Mara approached the mirror, her reflection shifting oddly with each step. It no longer moved in sync with her, lagging behind as though it were reluctant to follow. She reached out to touch the glass. Her fingers sank into the surface as though it were water. A cold, numbing sensation crawled up her arm, and before she could pull away, the mirror pulled her in. Mara stumbled forward, landing hard on a stone floor. The air was icy, and an eerie blue light bathed the chamber she found herself in. The walls were carved with the same strange symbols she had seen throughout the house. Glowing softly in the dim light, she rose to her feet, her breath visible in the cold air. The chamber was vast, far larger than the house above could possibly contain. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, just beyond the reach of the light. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing through the chamber. The shadows stirred, coalescing into forms, twisted, human-like figures with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. They watched her in silence, their presence heavy and oppressive. Mara backed away, her heart racing. She turned to run, but the figures moved with her, matching her pace with unnatural precision. A voice echoed through the chamber, deep and resonant. The ritual must be completed. The figures closed in, their hollow eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Mara's mind raced, the words from the book flashing through her thoughts. The ritual must never be completed. She had to get out. Mara bolted, her footsteps echoing wildly in the vast chamber. The figures gave chase, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. The air grew colder with each step, sapping the strength from her limbs. Ahead, she saw the shimmering surface of the mirror, the way back. Mara threw herself toward it, her fingers reaching for the liquid glass. The shadows closed in around her, their icy breath on her neck. With a final burst of strength, she plunged through the mirror. She landed hard on the floor of the mirrored room. Gasping for air, the door to the hallway slammed shut behind her, cutting off the chilling cries of the figures. Mara lay on the floor for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was silent once more, but the air still felt heavy with unseen eyes watching her every move. Mara staggered to her feet, her body trembling. She had to leave, now. Clutching the book, she ran down the hallway and back to the staircase. The house seemed to shift around her, the walls closing in, the floor tilting beneath her feet. She burst through the front door, the swamp air hitting her like a slap to the face. The fog had thickened, swirling around her as though trying to pull her back inside. Without looking back, Mara sprinted to her truck and jumped in. Slamming the door shut, the engine roared to life, and she sped down the dirt road, the house disappearing into the mist behind her. As she drove, the words of the voice echoed in her mind. The ritual must be completed. Mara gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She didn't know what the ritual was, or why it had to be stopped, but one thing was clear. The Blackthorn house wasn't done with her yet. The ghost train of Pennsylvania. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and rusting metal as Lillian March walked along the overgrown tracks of the Abington rail line. A forgotten stretch of railway in the heart of Pennsylvania. The late October sky hung low and gray, casting a pale light over the landscape. The wind carried whispers through the skeletal branches of the surrounding trees, as if the forest itself were alive and watching. Lillian adjusted her scarf, tucking it tighter around her neck as a chill ran down her spine. She had grown up hearing the tales of the Asterisk ghost train, a spectral locomotive said to haunt this very line. The stories were part of local folklore, whispers of a cursed train that appeared on foggy nights, carrying souls lost to time. Just an old legend, she muttered to herself, trying to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the pull that had brought her here. According to the stories, the ghost train was a luxury express that had vanished without a trace one stormy night in 1903. No wreckage was ever found. No survivors were ever discovered. Some said the train had slipped into another dimension. Others believed it was cursed, doomed to wander the tracks for eternity. There were sightings over the years, glimpses of the train passing silently through the mist, its windows glowing with an otherworldly light. No one who boarded the train was ever seen again. Lillian had always dismissed the tales as fanciful fiction, but the strange letter she had received 2 days ago had changed everything. Come to the Abington rail line at midnight. You'll find what you're searching for. There was no signature, no explanation, just the cryptic message. Lillian couldn't ignore it. Her brother, James, had disappeared 5 years earlier, vanishing without a trace near these very tracks. The letter felt like a lifeline, a clue she couldn't afford to ignore. The abandoned station at Wicker's Hollow stood like a sentinel at the edge of the woods, its crumbling facade covered in ivy and graffiti. Lillian arrived just before midnight, her flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air was deathly still, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. The station's waiting room was a husk of its former self, broken benches, shattered windows, and a ticket counter covered in decades of dust. She made her way onto the platform, her breath visible in the cold night air. The tracks stretched into the darkness, swallowed by the fog that rolled in like a living thing. A distant whistle cut through the silence. Lillian froze. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the mournful call of a train. Her heart raced as she peered into the mist. The rails began to hum beneath her feet, and a soft, golden light appeared in the distance, growing brighter with each passing second. The ghost train was real. The train emerged from the fog, its sleek black engine gleaming under the pale light of the moon. It slowed as it approached the platform, its wheels grinding against the rails with an almost reluctant groan. The windows glowed with a strange, flickering light, and shadows moved inside, passengers who weren't quite human. The doors slid open with a hiss. Lillian hesitated, her pulse pounding in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but something stronger held her in place, a compulsion she couldn't explain. A figure stepped off the train. He was tall and dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, his face obscured by the shadow of his cap. "Miss March," he said, his voice smooth and chilling. "We've been expecting you. How do you know my name?" Lillian demanded, her voice trembling. The conductor smiled, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. "All aboard, Miss March. Your journey awaits." Lillian took a step back, her eyes darting to the dark forest behind her. She could still run, still escape whatever fate awaited her on that train. But then she thought of James, of the countless nights she had spent searching for answers, of the hollow ache that had never gone away. "I want to find my brother," she said, her voice steadier now. The conductor tipped his hat. "Then step aboard, and we'll take you to him." Lillian swallowed hard and climbed onto the train. The doors closed behind her with a final, ominous thud. Inside, The train was a strange blend of luxury and decay. Velvet seats and polished brass fixtures contrasted with peeling wallpaper and flickering gas lamps. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and something darker, something rotten. Passengers filled the seats, their faces turned toward her. Their eyes were empty, their expressions frozen in strange, unsettling smiles. Lillian gripped the back of a seat to steady herself. "Where are we going?" "To the place where all lost things go," the conductor said. The train lurched forward, and the windows filled with swirling mist. The station disappeared behind them, swallowed by darkness. Lillian felt a strange pull in her chest, as if the train were tugging at something deep inside her, something she had buried long ago. Her journey had only just begun. The train rattled along the tracks, its wheels grinding against the rails with an eerie, rhythmic clatter. Lillian sat in one of the velvet-lined seats, her fingers gripping the edge of the armrest as she tried to steady her breathing. The passengers around her stared ahead, their expressions frozen in unsettling calm. None of them spoke or moved. The air inside the train was thick and cold, the flickering gas lamps casting ghostly shadows on the faded wallpaper. Every instinct in Lillian's body screamed for her to run, but there was no way out now. The train had begun its journey, and she was part of it. The conductor walked down the aisle, his footsteps unnaturally soft. His eyes, dark and gleaming, met hers. "We'll be arriving at our first stop soon," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I suggest you prepare yourself. The past has a way of catching up with passengers on this train." Lillian swallowed hard, her pulse racing. "What do you mean by that?" "All will be revealed in time," the conductor said, tipping his hat before continuing down the aisle. The train slowed, its wheels screeching against the tracks as it pulled into a station shrouded in mist. Through the window, Lillian could make out the faint outlines of an old platform, overgrown with ivy and bathed in an otherworldly glow. The doors hissed open, but no one stepped on or off the train. Instead, the shadows on the platform seemed to shift and coalesce into shapes, ghostly figures with hollow eyes and translucent skin. They watched her, their mouths moving soundlessly as if speaking words she couldn't hear. Lillian felt a strange pull toward them, a tugging sensation in her chest. She rose from her seat and walked to the doorway, her breath visible in the freezing air. "Don't step outside," a voice whispered behind her. Lillian turned to see a young woman sitting in the shadows at the back of the car. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Why not?" Lillian asked, her voice trembling. "If you leave the train, you'll never come back," the woman said. "This place isn't what it seems. It's a trap, a reflection of everything you've lost." Lillian looked back at the platform. The ghostly figures reached out to her, their eyes filled with longing and sorrow. "I'm looking for my brother," she said. "He disappeared 5 years ago. I need to know if he's here." The woman shook her head. "The train will take you where you need to go. But if you step off now, you'll be lost just like the others." Reluctantly, Lillian stepped back from the door. The train's whistle echoed through the mist, and the doors slid shut with a final, chilling thud. The train picked up speed, hurtling through a landscape that grew increasingly surreal. The trees outside the windows twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the sky. The ground beneath them shimmered like liquid glass, reflecting a starless, black void. Lillian's heart sank as she realized they were no longer in Pennsylvania, or in any place she recognized. "Where are we?" she whispered to the young woman. "Between worlds," the woman replied. "This train travels through places that shouldn't exist. It takes us to what we've lost, and what we fear most." Lillian's chest tightened. "And my brother? Is he really here?" The woman hesitated. "He might be, but you have to be careful. Not everything on this train is what it seems. Some things wear familiar faces to lure you in." The train slowed again, and the flickering lamps dimmed. The air grew colder, and an oppressive silence filled the car. Lillian's breath hitched as the walls of the train seemed to ripple and shift. Suddenly, James appeared at the far end of the car. He looked exactly as he had the day he disappeared, same tousled brown hair, same worn leather jacket. "Lillian?" he called, his voice barely audible. Tears filled her eyes as she rushed toward him. "James, I've been looking for you for so long. Where have you been?" He held out his hand. "Come with me. I'll explain everything. We can leave together." But something in the back of Lillian's mind screamed for her to stop. She remembered the woman's warning. Not everything is what it seems. "Where have you been all this time?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you come back?" James's eyes darkened. "There's no time to explain. Just take my hand." Lillian hesitated, her heart torn between hope and fear. His hand hovered inches from hers. And for a moment, everything else faded away. Then she saw it. His shadow didn't match his movements. While he stood still, the shadow twitched and writhed like a living thing. Lillian pulled back. "You're not my brother." James's face twisted into something monstrous. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his smile stretched too wide. "Oh, but I could be," he hissed. The train lurched violently, throwing Lillian to the floor. The windows shattered, and a deafening roar filled the air. Shadows poured into the car, swirling around her like a living storm. "Run!" the young woman shouted. Lillian scrambled to her feet and bolted down the aisle, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The train twisted and buckled beneath her, its walls warping and collapsing. Ahead, she saw the conductor standing at the final door, his eyes glowing like twin lanterns. "This is your stop, Miss March," he said, his voice echoing through the chaos. "Step through, and you'll find what you've been seeking." Without thinking, Lillian dove through the door. She hit the ground hard, the cold, damp earth beneath her bringing her back to reality. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as she looked around. The train was gone. The tracks were silent and overgrown, as if nothing had ever been there. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the woods. Lillian sat up, her body trembling. She clutched the scarf around her neck, trying to process what had just happened. She had found no answers, only more questions. But one thing was clear: something dark and ancient still haunted those tracks. The ghost train would return, and next time, it might not let her go.